So the book is called Anarchist Cybernetics by Thomas Swan. It's from 2020. And the 5th chapter is Control Part 2. And it is about effective freedom and collective autonomy. So for starters, I run into this problem all the time. So I'm going to give my my decomposition of the word autonomy. It is not an absolute one insofar as other people might use these terms a little differently. But if we really want to get at the gist of the topics people address with the word autonomy, there's a sort of political notion and there's a functional notion. The functional notion is the more technical one. It basically, when you think about an autonomous car, it has sort of tactical functional autonomy. Literally, it can act and respond to its environment according to its goals and constraints and whatnot. But it's it's something that we can think of in a very like software systems, like has the ability to act on its own in the sense of the information system. The political version is a bit more like what you read about in well, even DAOs, right? You're talking about individual autonomy means like when people talk about sort of self-sovereignty and their ability to make their own choices. But there's also a collective notion of this, which is where a group is capable of making decisions. And a lot of the times, what we really need in order to interact with the world is collective autonomy along some group lines. And in many cases, we have to concede some of our individual autonomy to be a meaningful part of a group, and possibly quite a bit when you look at all of the groups that we choose to be part of. What's left is hardly something that you would say is totally able to do whatever it wants, but on the other hand, it comes with the richness of the interactions through all of those memberships or group participations. So if we kind of just take for a moment that throughout this, I'm going to be quite precise about which autonomy I'm talking about. I'm not going to say, quote, autonomy very much. I'm going to point out which of these 4 things I'm talking about. Since the chapter is on collective autonomy, I pulled the definition straight out. It's the collectively determined capacity and scope an individual or group has to decide and act within the constraints set by collective organization. So in a sense, it's what we can do together. Functional autonomy is the degree of flexibility an individual or group within an organization has to respond to complexity as they see fit. My preferred way of describing this is, for example, when Kirsten was driving boats for the Coast Guard, and she's a bit higher rank now, but when she was younger, she drove boats and she had functional autonomy. Actually, as the driver, she got to make decisions immediately, had basically command of the vessel, even when there were other people on it of higher rank, because you need functional, and in particular, tactical functional autonomy in that moment in order to respond to the complexity as they see fit. That example also helps elicit why I choose to be very clear about the difference between strategic and tactical functional autonomy, because she doesn't actually have the ability to deviate from the goals, and there may still be some constraints on that. And so, separating the functional autonomy and the sort of immediate opportunity to interact with or to respond to the environment is different from having full autonomy in the sense that you get to decide what you do with those degrees of freedom. And so I have chosen to label the more goal setting aspect of that the strategic functional autonomy, which is still something that even software systems need to have. In some cases, you'll have a higher order goal dictated by a higher order system, which provides a lower level system with instruction, but that lower level system may still have the tactical autonomy to solve that problem as it see fits. And that nests sort of infinitely, as it were. It's important, though, to realize that when we're talking about processes and systems, they don't necessarily have to be implemented in a, quote, centralized way. They can be, the actual system itself can have functional autonomy and be distributed, or like physically distributed, or even politically decentralized. Tactical functional autonomy makes political decentralization possible. So if you give people degrees of freedom to decide how to do things. You can still share a collective goal, and in fact have maybe we could argue it's a distributed system at that point, but shared goal, individual tactical autonomy pursuant to that goal. But then are there circumstances in which the shared goals get thinner and thinner, such that you could call that system decentralized, because the shared sort of strategic functional autonomy says, well, we just want to feel safe. And then the extent to which we define narrower goals for ourselves, strategic functional autonomy, resides within maybe a lower, more individual political economy. But the truth is that for real systems, they probably have modes, meaning like some things, some aspects need to be shared by everyone, and some aspects need to be pressed down to the edges. And I think that you could recover an argument, a potentially quite mathematically formal argument for subsidiarity by looking at pushing as much autonomy down as possible in order to achieve shared goals. It's just a question of that, again, that nesting of, okay, but like who sets the goals? And therefore, how much, again, relative, but how much autonomy do I have over my own goals, not just over my own means of achieving those goals? So even the functional side becomes relative. So, being careful about autonomy as a relative concept in both the political and functional, or the social, political and functional is basically social and technical reads on this word. And I think that if we take care with the use of the word, it can be very powerful. When we use it blithely and just talk about autonomy, I think we muddle things and we don't necessarily help achieve healthier systems. I'm not going to try to resolve the question of decentralization because it's about as complex as the term autonomy, and I'm going to take like probably 15 minutes just to continue to talk about autonomy. So I guess I sort of started to front run myself here. So autonomy is relative. So as I said, our reading defined functional autonomy as tactical autonomy, but made some references to goals and or purpose. Tactical autonomy is defined with respect to purpose or goal. So we need a notion of strategic autonomy that accounts for goal setting. So as long as tactical autonomy is something that requires a goal, then there is a kind of autonomy that supersedes it, which would always be related to goal setting. I don't think that's a huge lift, and we see it all the time when we're programming automations that we have to automate to accomplish something, and the capacity of the automated thing to optimize for an outcome requires it to be given, a target outcome. So kind of switching, I'm kind of continue to go back and forth between the technical and more social context. So whether an individual or group, political autonomy is most often autonomy from some other actors, individuals, or groups. So it's very difficult to describe the political autonomy without having like an edge to something, right? If you just say, I'm politically autonomous, you're like, well, in a way, it means there's nothing to compare to, so it kind of collapses. So, as a group, then of course you would start to look inside the group and compare the individual relative to the collective. But if you roll all the way up to a collective with no other collectives or entities of the same order, nothing to compare to, it doesn't mean very much. So it's important to understand that sort of autonomy in the political sense, as we understand it, is basically always relative to something. So now we're going to do a quick intuition check. Would you get in I need to fix that. In an autonomous car if you didn't get to decide where it was going to take you? I would not. My individual autonomy in this case leads me to want strategic functional autonomy. In other words, I won't get in the car because I don't get to decide where it's going to go. If I get to decide where it goes, then fine. Like that's effectively calling an Uber, because the car driver system is autonomous. and it's going to take me where I want it to take me. So I have the strategic functional autonomy, even though the driver has the tactical functional autonomy. And if it happened to be an autonomous car in the sense that it was self-driving, then that self-driving car replaces the car driver system. And so you would continue to choose to get in it, or at least I would, only if I would retain that goal setting kind of autonomy, even though I happily conceded the effort, the cognitive overhead beyond that, because the outcome is the thing I want. I will note, though, that if it's an autonomous police car, I may not get a choice. And again, maybe it's an autonomous car plus person system, but it may very well be that that entity is capable of sort of superseding my individual autonomy by some collective autonomy as manifested by a government, hopefully a legitimate government. Hopefully that's not like a secret police, and that's someone who's coming because I don't know, but I'll try not to do anything that puts me in that situation. All right, so this sort of brings us to constraints on autonomy. So autonomous parts must operate in coordination with other autonomous parts. This is also directly from the reading. Autonomous parts must operate within the intentions of the whole organization, and autonomous parts must face the possibility of being excluded from the organization as a whole. So the first two are, I think, relatively straightforward. Means that if you kind of have like a pairwise coordination or sort of a local coordination, as long as there are many parts, you're going to have part-to-part constraints. And then as long as those parts are thought of as a whole, then you're going to have part to whole constraints. So interestingly, I would argue that the number 2 goes in both directions, that the whole is constrained by the parts and the parts are constrained by the whole. So, part to part and part to whole, both I would argue are bilateral. And then the third one, autonomous parts must face the possibility of being excluded from the organization as a whole. I think that this is sort of important. It's a lot of nuance here, and I think you could do a whole presentation on this. But I think the idea is that if there's no notion of a boundary, then there's really no way of giving the entity cohesion, because this thing can essentially, I hate to call it like grow cancerously, but it can grow cancerously. I don't want to take this to its deeper sort of societal politically questions, although there's a little bit more coverage of that in the book. But I think we're talking about systems that are technical or functional in nature, not necessarily societal at the moment. But my way of reconciling that is that the function of a society system can include care for its like membership. So at that point, it's not that people are being excluded because they don't contribute to the like technical production of the entity, but rather that people might be excluded for refusing to care for the people who need care. Not exactly clear how that would work out, because it's, again, big questions of sort of how to structure a society. But it's important to recognize that saying that someone can be excluded is not equivalent to saying that people will be excluded for non-productivity. It means that they could be excluded in general for their behavior, for their choice to act outside of what we might think of as the value system or the social contract or the constitution. In a permissionless protocol, or just more generally in a permissionless system, the idea is that the notion of exclusion or inclusion is kind of turned on its head, in that rather than someone giving you permission to join the system, you effectively permission yourself by following the stated rules. And as long as you follow the stated rules, you get to use the infrastructure. And as long as you don't, but then again, it's sort of baked into it. And this is a pretty, in some ways, a sort of natively internet thing, because you program the rules and you then encode the system in such a way that following the rules allows you to use it, and not following the rules prevents you from using it, and that's just sort of like a fact of the system. It's not something that necessarily someone comes and enforces. But again, it's specific to a kind of protocol that is can be manifest in that way, that like, in a peer-to-peer network, you just get dropped if you're not following the protocol. Then sort of naturally, we're going to move into this notion of consensus decision-making. In a technical sense, consensus protocols provide a means through which software agents in a peer-to-peer network agree on the state of the world. This is, in the political sense, a collective autonomy. In a functional tactical autonomy. Basically, we're giving each of the agents a set of rules about how they come to collective agreement on a fact or a set of facts. They don't have the ability to sort of decide a new goal, but they don't have the ability to sort of, I would say, like, overly assert their individualism. They each have to agree on the same state of the world, but they have a lot of degrees of freedom in terms of what they do pursuant to that. So that's a way of thinking about consensus protocols. For social side, consensus or weaker consent decision making aims to create shared rules and or goals that everyone can support, at least live with. And then I would argue that this is, again, politically collective autonomy, but functionally it's strategic autonomy. It's the difference between deciding what it is we hope to achieve and what constraints we might hold ourselves to in pursuing that is actually quite different from deciding how you go about doing things, but without having the power to decide what you are going about doing or what value is, for example, what is considered valuable. Then we kind of come to this term effective freedom, and I'm sort of paraphrasing, but both functional autonomy and collective autonomy are defined in part as negotiation between individualism and collectivism, between the desire for operational freedom and the need to remain part of an overarching organization. So in effect, we have to define that freedom relative to other things. And in my opinion, the essence of this is that strategic functional. The strategic functional autonomy at the collective scale is where we look for the capacity to self-govern, or the capacity to self-organize, to define the goals and constraints and the binding of the group to the shared goals and constraints that were defined together. And so that's how I would characterize effective freedom, with basically the idea that, cool, we want freedom both as individuals and as groups, and that we can organize ourselves in such a way that we have about as much of that as possible while still basically respecting each other and pursuing shared goals. So this is for a blockchain related thing, so I'm going to tie this into blockchains and potentially the legitimacy of those systems. So I'll note that protocols such as those used in peer-to-peer networks are clearly stated rules such that failure to adhere is tantamount to self-exclusion. So we do have this connection back to being excluded. One would argue then that this provides tactical autonomy, because you have to participate in the protocol in order to be included. But as long as you meet that as long as you meet that one restriction, then you often still have quite a bit of degrees of freedom, and that this notion of self-exclusion does come up. So it's the individual choosing to participate in the whole and thus binding themselves to the rules of the whole, with the understanding that if they choose to cease to do that, then they can expect to be excluded from the network. I think that that's helpful because it gives us a lens for seeing peer-to-peer networks in the context of these sort of four autonomies. And then sort of going to the very last statement in the chapter that was the reading, we say that the freedom we embrace, beer rights, must yet be in control. That means that people must endorse the regulatory model at the heart of the viable system in which they partake. Now, obviously that feels a little jargony, but I think the key here is that in control we're talking about is that strategic the strategic functional autonomy. It's that there still has to be some sort of decision about the regulatory model or the thing that describes the system or defines the system, and people have to be they have to actually endorse it, or they have to believe that it's appropriate to be part of it. And so it's kind of interesting to see it written this way because it's quite hard to draw out. But I hope that sort of having unpacked the other terms, it makes sense that he's again evoking the strategic rather than the tactical functional autonomy when he talks about being in control, and endorsing that. And so kind of wrapping up, so protocols or rules which constrain individual autonomy may offer those same individuals a degree of tactical autonomy. There's something to be said, right, for having the rules tell you what you can do, because they don't just remove actions, they give you a field of action. And so insofar as you can do these things and that they're considered appropriate and within the system, the whole, then you have actually the freedom to do them, and to do them in near real time, which I think is actually pretty interesting. And it goes back to the previous example about the boat driver, where the fact that the rules say that you have the autonomy to act in response to that stimulus allows you to respond and not have to go looking for permission, or not having to question. That's in your admissible action space, so to speak. So these constraints can be seen as legitimate by those persons insofar as this enables the expression of collective autonomy pursuant to goals. So in other words, now we have this ability to go fulfill, act, express, do, and we are bound pursuant to some goals, or whatever it is that the rule set essentially was created in order to enable. But as long as we had some say or strategic autonomy over that goal and constraint making, then I would argue that that is a legitimate system. And so, that's legitimate constraints on our autonomy. When we're talking about designing rules, in our case, we're designing effectively unbreakable rules insofar as long as the infrastructure is present and you use it, it denies you actions outside of the rule set, which is a bit like the way physics works, right? So, when I think about rules, I'm not necessarily thinking about things where there's a force that will come in and enforce, though I'll admit I do use the police car example for a reason, to sort of remind us that there is that. But I don't think there is only that. So maybe a better way to disambiguate it is that one way of enforcing rules is with power, in the sense of the police coming and taking you away against your will. But another way is the way that like physics works, which is some rules simply are the way things work, and no amount of trying would violate them. Conservation of energy, for example. And I think much of the programmatic mechanism design that we do involves systems that simply work the way they work, and you would exclude yourself rather than break the system. So like if you think of these as emergent self-organizing systems, then if you were to try to violate conservation of energy by not eating, you would die. If you were to try to submit transactions that were invalid under the mechanisms, they would simply not happen. If you tried to break the peer-to-peer protocol in the peer-to-peer network, you just could get dropped by the peers. So like, the enforcement in this system is generally the opposite of the exercise of power from the top down, and more of a sort of self-exclusion by refusal to accept, or by repeated attempts to use the system against its intrinsic rule sets, rather than sort of the rules being superimposed. And I know that's not a complete solution, but I think it's worth noting that systems that have their rules baked into them in the sort of physics-like way behave differently than systems that work through enforcement by coercion. Most of the cybernetics literature is basically applied social science of control theory and like dynamical systems and all my favorite math things. So it's very useful for me as a way to reason about engineering mechanisms, engineering institutions through the construction of rules. So that's it as my little like fin. Hopefully the math nerds get it. That's an autonomous system, and that's the like QED, or like sort of proof completed symbol.